The night she ran from everything she had ever known, the Colorado mountains did not care one bit whether she lived or died. Her name was Clara Mae Whitfield, and she was 23 years old, and she had made the single bravest and most terrifying decision of her entire life somewhere around midnight on a Tuesday in late October of 1882. She had climbed out of the second-floor window of the Hargrove household, where she had served as cook and housekeeper for the better part of 2 years, with nothing but a canvas sack containing a change of clothes, a small tin of biscuits she had baked herself that afternoon, a little over $4 in coins she had saved from the rare moments Gerald Hargrove had paid her at all, and the map she had torn from the back page of a cattle almanac she found in the parlor. The map was old and probably not accurate, but it was all she had, and Clara Mae Whitfield had always been the kind of woman who worked with what she had, rather than weeping over what she lacked. She had a reason for running that had nothing to do with adventure and everything to do with survival. Gerald Hargrove was 47 years old, thick-necked and red-faced, with small eyes that tracked Clara everywhere she moved in his house. His wife had died of fever the previous spring, and since the funeral he had made his intentions toward Clara known in ways that started as uncomfortable glances and had, by October, progressed into something far more threatening. He had grabbed her wrist in the kitchen 3 days ago. He had come to her door 2 nights ago, and when Clara had told him plainly that she would not be treated that way, he had informed her with a cold smile that she owed him for her room and board and that debts had to be paid one way or another. Clara had started packing that same night. She had no family left in Gunnison, Colorado. Her mother had passed 2 years prior, and her father had walked away from them both when Clara was barely old enough to remember his face. She had one distant cousin somewhere in Denver, a woman named Edith she had met exactly once at a family gathering when Clara was 12 years old. Edith had seemed kind. That was enough to aim for, as far as Clara was concerned. Denver was northeast, and the map said so, and that was where she was going. What the map had not told her was what late October in the Colorado high country looked like at 2 in the morning, when the temperature dropped like a stone thrown off a cliff face and the wind came down from the peaks with a fury that felt deeply personal. Clara had dressed warmly. She was a practical woman, always had been, but the cold that met her as she moved away from the lights of Gunnison and into the dark foothills was a different creature, entirely from the manageable chill of a town evening. It had teeth. It pressed itself against her like something alive and hungry, and by the time she had been walking for 2 hours, she had stopped being able to feel her feet properly. She had chosen to go on foot rather than risk the main road, because the main road would pass directly in front of the Hargrove property at its eastern edge, and she did not want to be seen. The route she had chosen through the hills was longer, but quieter, and she had told herself that longer and quieter was a reasonable trade. She had not accounted for how the trail, which seemed clear enough on her map, simply ceased to exist once she was actually on it, swallowed up by darkness and loose rock and stands of pine that all looked identical to one another in the moonlight. By 3 in the morning, Clara Mae Whitfield was hopelessly, thoroughly lost. She sat down on a flat boulder to catch her breath and took stock of herself with the same unsentimental practicality she applied to everything. Her feet were cold but functional. Her hands were cold, but she could still feel them if she tucked them under her arms. She had eaten 2 of her biscuits. She had $4.17. She was lost in the mountains north of Gunnison at 3 in the morning in late October, and she had absolutely no idea where she was going. She did not cry. Clara Mae had never been much of a crier, not because she was hard or cold, but because she had learned young that tears did not rearrange the world into something more convenient, and she preferred to spend her energy on more productive things. She looked up at the sky instead, which was enormous and blazing with stars in a way that city skies never managed, and she breathed slowly and tried to remember anything useful her mother had told her about navigation. She was still doing this, breathing slowly, looking upward, refusing to panic, when she heard the sound. It was the sound of hooves, a single horse moving at a walk somewhere above and to her left on the hillside. Then a voice, low and rough as gravel under a boot heel, speaking to the animal in words she could not quite make out. Then a pause, and then the voice again, louder, and this time she understood it clearly. Who is down there?" Clara stood up very fast and gripped her canvas sack. She looked in the direction of the voice and could see nothing in the dark trees. Every instinct she had fired in two opposite directions at once, run and also stay very still, and the result was that she did neither, only stood there on the boulder like a deer that has not yet decided what to do about the sound. "I can see you against the sky," the voice said. It was not unkind. It was not particularly gentle either. It was simply matter of fact, the way a man spoke when he was used to the wilderness answering him honestly. "So you might as well say something." "I'm not doing anything wrong," Clara said, and was annoyed at herself for leading with that. There was a short silence, and then what might have been the suggestion of a quiet exhale, not quite a laugh, not quite dismissive. "Did not say you were. You alone out here?" "Yes." "On foot?" "Yes." Another silence. Then the sound of the horse moving again, picking its way carefully down through the trees toward her, and Clara made herself stand still and watch it come, because running in the mountains in the dark had a very limited future, and because something in the tone of the voice, the lack of menace in it, the kind of careful neutrality that a person only develops when they have spent real time in wild places, told her that panic would be the wrong response here. The horse emerged from the tree line first, a big, dark animal, and then its rider came with it into the moonlight, and Clara Mae Whitfield looked at the mountain man who had found her and understood immediately why the wilderness felt like it belonged to him. He was enormous, not in the soft way that Gerald Hargrove had been broad, not in the puffed and padded way of men who ate well and worked little. This man was enormous the way a Douglas fir was enormous, built for exactly the conditions that surrounded him, dense with the kind of muscle that came from years of physical work in hard country, and utterly unbothered by any of it. He sat his horse like he had been assembled there. He was probably somewhere in his early to mid-30s, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a jaw that needed attention from a razor, and eyes that caught the moonlight in a way that made them hard to read from a distance. He wore a heavy coat and leather gloves and a hat pulled low, and when he looked down at her from the saddle there was nothing predatory in the look, nothing calculating. Only assessment, the look of a man taking in a situation and deciding what needed to be done about it. "You're lost," he said. It was not a question. "I know where I'm going," Clara said, which was technically true. She knew she was going to Denver. The fact that she currently did not know where she was seemed like a separate matter. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the sky, at the mountains, at the trail she had not managed to find, and then back at her. "It is below freezing and getting colder," he said, "and there is weather coming down from the north. You can see the edge of it there." He lifted his chin toward the northwest, where Clara now noticed that the blazing field of stars ended in a wall of solid dark, a blankness that moved with a slowness that was somehow more alarming than speed. "You will not make another 5 miles before that hits." Clara looked at the approaching weather front and felt the wind shift against her face, sharper and wetter than it had been. She looked back at the man. "I have to keep moving," she said. "To where?" She hesitated for only a second. "Denver." He absorbed this without visible reaction. "Tonight?" "I need to get away from Gunnison." Something in his expression shifted, very slightly, and she had the sense that he was doing some private calculation, drawing some kind of conclusion from the combination of her canvas sack and her 2 in the morning mountain trail and her need to get away from Gunnison tonight. Whatever conclusion he reached, he kept it behind his eyes. "My cabin is 2 miles up this ridge," he said. "You can wait out the storm. I have a stove." Clara looked at him. She thought about Gerald Hargrove and what it felt like to be threatened by a man in his own house. She thought about the wall of weather moving toward her from the northwest. She thought about her feet, which were beginning to report seriously concerning information. "I do not know you," she said. "Eli Cade," he said. "I trap beaver and elk along the upper Gunnison. I bring the pelts down to town 4 times a year. That's my whole life. I'm not interested in anything from you except getting you inside before that storm hits." He paused. "Your call, but I would make it fast." The wind shifted again, carrying a thin edge of ice on its breath, and Clara Mae Whitfield made her decision. "All right," she said. He did not make a production of it. He simply dismounted in one fluid motion, took his horse's reins, and said, "Can you walk 2 miles?" And when she said yes, he said, "Stay close then," and started up the hillside through the trees as if he had done this particular thing 1,000 times, which perhaps he had, because he moved through the dark forest with a confidence and surety that made Clara feel, for the first time since midnight, like the ground beneath her feet was trustworthy. She stayed close. She did not speak, and neither did he, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable, only the silence of two people who were focused on the same task. He led the horse with one hand and occasionally reached back with the other to hold aside a pine branch that might have caught her in the face, or to indicate a root or a loose stone in the path, and these small practical gestures were performed without ceremony or expectation of thanks. In the same matter-of-fact way, he did everything else. The storm hit when they were still a 1/4 mile from the cabin. It did not come gradually. It arrived all at once, the wind doubling in force in less than a minute, and the first hard pellets of sleet arriving with it, stinging against Clara's cheeks and the backs of her hands. The temperature dropped so sharply it seemed almost violent. The horse threw its head, and Eli spoke to it in a low voice and kept moving, and Clara tucked her face down against the wind and did the same, and they covered the last 1/4 mile at a pace that cost her considerably in cold and exertion and stubbornness. But she made it, her jaw set and her eyes forward, and when the low, dark shape of the cabin materialized out of the driving sleet, she felt a relief so profound it almost staggered her. Eli moved fast and without wasted motion. He got the horse into a small lean-to shelter at the side of the cabin, out of the wind, saw to the animal with a quick efficiency that said this was not a man who treated a horse as merely a tool. Then he was at the cabin door, which was unlocked, and he pushed it open and gestured Clara inside and followed her in, pulling the door shut behind him against the screaming wind. The cabin was a single room, low-ceilinged and plain, but it was solid and weatherproof, and it smelled of pine resin and wood smoke and dried herbs and something that was probably leather and lanolin. There was a stove along one wall with embers still glowing in it, a workbench covered in trapping equipment and tools, 2 wooden chairs, a bunk built into the far wall, and a few shelves holding an assortment of supplies. There was a skin on a stretching frame near the workbench, and several others rolled and stacked in the corner. A rifle hung above the door. A lantern hung from the ceiling beam. Eli lit the lantern from the coals of the stove without fuss, then added wood to the stove from a stack beside it, and had a real fire going inside of a minute. The stove began to throw heat almost immediately, and Clara stood in the middle of the room and felt the cold in her hands and face begin painfully to release. She became aware, in the warm lantern light, that she was shaking. Not dramatically, she was too composed for that, but her hands were trembling inside her coat, and her jaw was making a small, persistent effort to chatter that she was suppressing through an act of will. Eli saw it. He said nothing about it, only moved to one of the shelves and took down a wool blanket, which he held out to her. She took it and wrapped it around her shoulders, and then sat down in one of the chairs near the stove. He hung his coat on a peg by the door and moved to the small shelf that served as a kitchen, where there was a pot and a water bucket and a few tins, and she watched him fill the pot and set it on the stove and measure coffee grounds into it from a cloth bag with the ease of a man who lived alone and had worked out every domestic process to its most efficient form. In the lantern light, without his hat and coat, she could see him more clearly, and what she saw was remarkable in the plainest, most unself-conscious way. He was tall enough that he had to angle slightly through the doorway, with shoulders that were broad in a way that seemed structural rather than ornamental, and his arms and chest and back, visible through the flannel of his shirt, were built from what was clearly years of hard mountain work, the kind of muscle that had no interest in being admired, that existed purely for function, for pulling and carrying and climbing and surviving. His hair was dark brown and fell to just below his collar in the way of a man who cut it when it inconvenienced him and not before, and his hands were large and scarred and capable. He was perhaps 33 or 34, and there was nothing young about his face, which had been worked on by sun and wind and altitude into something that was not handsome in any fashionable way, but was compelling in the way that things shaped by honest forces always were. He poured 2 mugs of coffee when it was ready and set one on the hearth near her feet without asking whether she wanted it. She picked it up with both hands and drank and felt warmth move through her chest and into her belly like something being repaired. "You should get your boots off," he said, sitting in the other chair with his own mug. "Let your feet warm slow, not fast." Clara looked at him. "How do you know they need warming?" "You were walking at 3 in the morning in October. They need warming." She could not argue with that. She pulled off her boots and then her wool stockings, the bottom of them wet through, and set them near the stove, and when the circulation began to return to her toes. She was glad he had said slow rather than fast, because it was uncomfortable enough even without the direct heat. They sat in silence for a while, the storm raging beyond the cabin walls in a way that was genuinely alarming to listen to and completely irrelevant inside, where the stove was doing its job and the lantern light was steady and warm. The cabin felt safe in a way that Clara had not expected, a deep structural safety that came from the quality of the building and the adequacy of its supplies, not from any particular accommodation of her comfort. "I should tell you," she said eventually, "that I will be leaving as soon as the storm passes." "I know that," he said. "I am not asking for anything more than shelter from the storm." He looked at her over his coffee mug, and his expression held something that might have been the very earliest suggestion of amusement. "I heard you the first time." Clara felt her face warm slightly, and it was not from the stove. She looked away and then looked back. "I'm sorry. That was rude." "No," he said. "It was careful. That is different." He paused. "You said you need to get away from Gunnison. Hargrove?" She went very still. "You know him?" "I know of him. I bring pelts to town. People talk." His jaw tightened fractionally. "He has a reputation." Clara wrapped both hands around her mug and chose her words deliberately. "He made it clear that he expected payment for my room and board in a currency I was not willing to offer, so I left." "You walked out of Gunnison in the middle of the night." "I did. Alone. With what looks like 40 pounds of supplies." "About that, yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You are either very brave or very foolish." "Probably some of both," Clara said. "My mother always said I had more nerve than sense." Something happened in his expression, a very small thing, a softening that came and went so quickly she almost missed it. He looked at the stove. "Where in Denver?" "I have a cousin. Her name is Edith. I met her once when I was 12. He looked back at her. "That is your plan?" Clara lifted her chin. "It is what I have." He held her gaze for a moment longer, and then simply nodded, as if he had decided that a plan made of less than ideal materials was still a plan, and deserved to be treated as one. "Road to Denver through the mountain passes is going to be rough after this storm. You will need at least a week before the mud settles, longer if there is real snowfall tonight." Clara thought about this. She thought about Gerald Hargrove waking up in the morning and finding her gone, about whether he would bother to look for her, about whether she had covered her tracks well enough. "He will come looking," she said, not meaning to say it aloud. "Then you should not be on the main road," Eli said, and the way he said it, simple and direct as if her safety were a logistical problem to be solved rather than a source of drama, made something ease in her chest that had been clenched tight since midnight. "You do not need to involve yourself in my trouble," she said. "You're in my cabin," he said. "That already involves me." She looked at him for a long moment. The storm battered the walls. The stove crackled. Outside, the October mountains were absolutely indifferent to everything, and in here there was only the lantern light and the coffee, and this stranger who had found her lost in the dark and brought her to warmth without asking for anything in return. "My name is Clara," she said. "Clara Whitfield." "I know," he said. "I have heard that name too." She blinked. "From who?" "Tom Briggs at the dry goods. He said Hargrove had a cook worth about a dozen men. Meant it as a compliment." He paused. "Said she had red hair and no patience for nonsense." Clara touched her hair involuntarily. It was red, a deep auburn that had given her trouble her whole life, because people in 1882 Colorado had opinions about red-headed women that she found exhausting. "Tom Briggs is a gossip." "Yes?" Eli agreed, and this time the suggestion of amusement was more definite, a very slight shift at the corner of his mouth that was absolutely not a smile and was also somehow unmistakably warm. She went to sleep in the bunk eventually, because the warmth and the exhaustion and the sheer physiological relief of safety were too much to resist, and Eli spread his bedroll on the floor by the stove without any conversation about arrangements or propriety, simply making it clear by his actions that this was how it was going to be. And that was that. Clara lay in the bunk and listened to the storm and felt, for the first time in months, that the immediate world was contained and manageable. And she slept. She woke to daylight and silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world so white and clean and bright it almost hurt to look at through the small greased paper window. The stove was burning steadily. He had tended it while she slept, and Eli was at the workbench cleaning a piece of trapping equipment with the same focused efficiency she was beginning to understand was simply his natural state of being. He had made porridge. There was a bowl of it on the hearth, still warm, covered with a cloth, with a small tin of dried berries beside it. Clara sat up and looked at the porridge, and then looked at him. "You did not have to do that," she said. "You have to eat," he said, without looking up from his work. "Same as anyone." She ate, and the porridge was plain and wholesome and exactly what she needed, and she thought about the fact that this man had found her lost and frightened in the mountain dark, had brought her to warmth and shelter, had given up his bunk and made her coffee and porridge and asked for nothing, and had sat in this cabin through the whole long night without once making her feel like the size of her body or the circumstances of her flight were anything other than matters of simple fact. She should explain that. She was a large woman. She knew it, had known it her whole life, had grown up hearing opinions about it from people who seemed to believe their opinions were a form of gift. She had broad hips and a full figure, and a chest that had been the subject of commentary she had never solicited, and she had spent years in Gerald Hargrove's house, where his opinions on the subject had gone from implied to explicit in ways that still made her skin crawl. She had learned to cover herself as much as possible, to minimize, to make herself smaller in every sense she could manage, even when she could not manage the literal one. Eli Cade had not looked at her body once in any way that she could categorize as anything other than assessment for the purposes of determining whether she was cold. She did not know what to do with that. After breakfast, she washed her bowl and spoon in the basin he had set out for the purpose, and then turned to find him putting on his coat. "I need to check my trap lines," he said. "I will be back before noon. The snow is not deep enough to cause problems on the main trail. There's more wood by the stove and more coffee on the shelf." He paused at the door. "Do not go outside until I get back. The snow hides the terrain, and it is easy to lose the trail close to the ravine." "I am not your responsibility," Clara said, though she said it without heat. He looked at her steadily from the doorway. "While you are in my cabin, yes, you are." And then he was gone, pulling the door quietly shut behind him. Clara spent the morning exploring the cabin, which was small enough that this did not take long, but held enough interest in its details to occupy her considerably. She had always been curious about the way people lived when they thought no one was watching, and the way Eli Cade lived told a story that was spare and honest and unexpectedly complex. There were books on the shelf beside the supplies, 3 of them, which was not a small number for a mountain trapper in 1882. A worn Bible, a copy of Moby Dick that had been read enough times its spine was soft, and a small volume of poetry that surprised her so much she took it down and opened it. John Keats. Well marked, with notes in the margins in a tight, careful hand. She put it back carefully and stood there thinking about Eli Cade and his Keats until she heard his horse on the trail outside. He came in with 2 beaver in the game bag over his shoulder and the snow in his hair and a look on his face that was the same as when he had left, contained and steady, but his eyes went to her immediately in the way of a man checking that a thing is still where he left it in a state of safety, and then went to the stove in the room with an efficiency that was not suspicion, but simply the habit of a man who noted everything. "Roads will be passable in 3 days," he said, hanging the game bag. "Possibly 2, depending on temperature." Clara nodded. She had been thinking while he was out about the practical geometry of her situation. "How far is Denver by the back trails, the ones that do not go through Gunnison's main road?" He considered. 6 days, maybe 7 with the current conditions, through the pass at Cottonwood, then north along the upper Arkansas Valley. Do you know those trails? He looked at her. Yes. Clara held his gaze. She had thought about this and thought about it while he was gone, turning it over and examining it from every angle she could think of, and she had arrived at a conclusion that her pride did not love but that her good sense insisted upon. I would like to hire you to guide me to Denver, she said. I have $4.17, and I will give you all of it. He was quiet for a moment. I cannot take a woman's last $4. It is my money, and I am offering it freely. Your cousin in Denver, he said. Does she have a husband, a house? Are you sure she's even still there? Clara's certainty wobbled slightly, but she did not let it show. I have nowhere else to go. You could go back to town. I will not go back. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said quietly. I do not suppose you would. He turned and hung his coat and moved to the workbench and stood there for a moment with his hands braced on its edge, looking at the wall. Then he said, without turning around, I will take you to Denver. Keep your money. The relief was enormous, and Clara throttled it down to something she could express with dignity. I am grateful. Do not thank me yet. The pass at Cottonwood in late October is not a pleasant road. He turned around, and there was something in his face that was not quite concern, not soft enough for that, but was the direct precursor to it, something watchful and steady. You will need proper boots. Yours are not mountain boots. I have what I have. There's a pair of my old moccasins that are too small for me. They will fit you, and they are waterproof. He went to the shelf and produced them, heavy elk hide, carefully worked with thick soles. He set them on the table between them. Clara looked at the moccasins and then at him. These are yours. Were mine. Now they are yours. He said it with such complete finality that she understood arguing would be a waste of everyone's time. All right, she said. Thank you, Eli. He looked at her when she used his name, the first time she had, and something moved in his expression that he controlled almost instantaneously, but not quite quickly enough. He nodded once and turned back to the workbench. They left 2 days later, on a morning that was cold and bright and achingly clear, the kind of Colorado autumn morning that exists somewhere between beauty and brutality. Eli had spent those 2 days preparing with a thoroughness that Clara found both impressive and quietly touching. He had checked and oiled and repacked his saddlebags, prepared provisions, and done something with her canvas sack that resulted in it being properly distributed and balanced for carrying rather than slung over one shoulder in the way she had been doing. He had also said, on the second evening, while they were eating the rabbit stew he had made, because he cooked the same way he did everything else, with absolute competence and no fuss. Hargrove sent 2 men up the north road yesterday. I saw them from the ridge when I went to check my lines. Clara put down her spoon. He's looking for me. Seems so. She thought about Gerald Hargrove's cold smile and the way he had grabbed her wrist. What do I do? Nothing, Eli said simply. We are not going the north road. She looked at him and felt something settle in her chest that she was not entirely sure was just the warmth of the stove. You saw them and you went and checked what road they were on? He met her eyes. Yes. You were watching out for me. You are a guest in my cabin, he said, and went back to his stew, and Clara Mae Whitfield made a private note about Eli Cade and the particular way his version of care operated, which was quietly and completely and without any expectation of acknowledgement. They made good time the first day, following a trail that wound up through the aspens and into the high country, where the air was thin and crystalline, and the views opened up into something so vast it was almost theological. Clara was fit. She'd been cooking and cleaning for a living for years, and before that she had helped her mother with everything, and she did not lack physical endurance. But the altitude was demanding, and Eli set a pace that was fast enough to cover ground and slow enough to keep her from struggling, adjusting without comment whenever the terrain required it. He let her ride when the trail permitted, walking beside the horse with his hand on the reins, and she was aware of his presence beside her in a way that was not uncomfortable but was very definite, the size of him against the mountain landscape, the way he moved, the quiet, contained energy of a man who was entirely at home in his element. She watched him without being entirely obvious about it, or tried to, and thought about Keats in his cabin and the care with which he had packed her bag. They camped the first night in a hollow out of the wind, below the tree line, where Eli set up a shelter with a practiced speed that had them out of the cold air in under half an hour. He made a fire and heated water and produced from some recess of his saddlebag a piece of dried elk that was better than it had any right to be, and some hard bread and dried apples. They sat by the fire and ate, and the silence between them was different from the silence of the cabin. It was an outdoor silence, bigger and more alive, full of the sounds of the forest at night, wind in the pines, a distant owl, the horse shifting in its makeshift pen of rope and stakes. "How long have you lived up here?" Clara asked. Eli looked into the fire. 8 years. You came from somewhere else? Missouri. What brought you to Colorado? A pause that was not evasive exactly, but that had the texture of a man deciding how much of a thing to give. My wife died, he said. Fever. I had a farm near Springfield. After she was gone, I could not be on it anymore. Came west, kept going until I found a place that asked nothing of me except that I work hard and leave it alone. Clara looked at his profile in the firelight. I'm sorry. About your wife. It was a long time ago, he said, but gently, in the way of someone who has made peace with a wound rather than pretended it does not exist. What was her name? He looked at her, and the look was brief and surprised and then settled. Anna, he said. She was 26. I am sorry, Clara said again, and meant it with the fullness of someone who understood loss at its most personal and had learned not to dress it up. He nodded once. Then, after a moment, in the same tone he used for everything, factual and direct but not cold. What will you do in Denver when you find your cousin? I can cook, Clara said. I can clean and sew and manage a household. I will find work. You could do that anywhere. I could, she agreed, but I want to be somewhere no one knows Gerald Hargrove's name and where I am not his employee and not his anything else. Eli turned a stick in the fire. Fair enough, he said. What will you do when you have delivered me to Denver? He shrugged slightly. Come back, run my lines. The season is good this year. He paused. I usually winter up here. It is quieter. Do you not get lonely? He considered this with the same seriousness he applied to everything. Sometimes, he said after a moment, but I'm not very good company. Clara looked at him. She thought about the books on his shelf and the Keats with notes in the margins and the way he had made her porridge and moccasins and readjusted her pack. I think you might be wrong about that, she said. He looked at her, and the fire between them made his eyes complicated and warm, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the night around them was enormous and full of stars and entirely unconcerned with what happened next. Then he said, Get some sleep, which was absolutely and completely characteristic of him, and Clara laughed, not a polite laugh but a real one, surprised out of her, and he looked at the sound of it with something that was not quite surprise and was not quite admiration, but lived in the neighborhood of both. She lay down in the bedroll he had set out for her and looked up at the stars through the gap in the shelter's roof and listened to his breathing change as he settled on the other side of the fire and thought that whatever happened in Denver, she would not forget Eli Cade for as long as she lived. The second day brought a challenge that neither of them had entirely anticipated. They were 2 hours into the morning's travel on a narrow trail that traversed the face of a slope above a steep drop when they came around a bend and found the trail blocked. Not by snow, not by rockfall, but by 3 men on horseback, spread across the path in a way that was unmistakably intentional. 2 of them Clara did not know. The third was Billy Crane, who worked for Gerald Hargrove and had been at the property for as long as Clara had, a lean, weasel-faced man who had always watched her with a look she had never trusted. Well now, Billy Crane said, looking at Clara with an expression that made her stomach drop. There she is. Mr. Hargrove will be pleased. Clara felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with the October air. She looked at the men, and at the drop below the trail, and at the narrow, impossible path forward, and thought, very clearly, that this was bad. Eli had stopped the horse and was sitting very still in the saddle. She could not see his face, but she could see the set of his shoulders, which had changed subtly, a gathering and settling that reminded her of something tectonic. She is not going back to Gunnison, Eli said. His voice was not raised, it was simply final, the way a mountain was final, the way a fall of rock was final. Billy Crane looked at him with the expression of a man who was accustomed to being the intimidating presence in a room and had not yet updated his understanding of the current situation. "This is not your business, friend." "It is now," Eli said. What happened next happened quickly. One of the other men reached for his rifle, which was a significant mistake, because Eli was off his horse before the rifle was halfway out of the scabbard, and then there was a short and decisive sequence of events that Clara processed largely as impressions. The raw force of Eli's movement, the way he was simply larger and faster and more dangerous than anyone he was dealing with, the sound of a man hitting the ground, with an authority that suggested he had not expected to, the rifle in the trail dust, Billy Crane's horse shying sideways. The third man, who had not moved yet, looked at the first man on the ground and at Eli standing in the trail, and made the sensible decision to be somewhere else. Billy Crane looked at Eli. He looked at the man on the ground. He looked back at Eli. "Hargrove is not going to forget this," he said. "Tell him," Eli said steadily, "that Clara Whitfield is a free woman going where she chooses, and that any man who comes after her will answer to me." Billy Crane held his gaze for a moment longer, then wheeled his horse and left, and the man on the ground got up, retrieved his dignity and not his rifle, and followed. The trail was empty. Clara sat on the horse and looked at Eli, who was standing in the path picking up the discarded rifle with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he brought to everything. He checked it, emptied it of its cartridges, and set it against the rock face to be collected or not by whoever came along. Then he came back to the horse and looked up at her. She realized she had been holding her breath and let it out slowly. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her with that not quite amused expression. "Yes, Clara." The way he said her name was not different from any other word he said, and it was also entirely different from every other word he said, and she was not sure whether this observation was the altitude or something considerably more significant. They rode on. The next 4 days on the trail had a rhythm to them that Clara settled into in the way she had always settled into work, with attention and willingness and a certain quiet pleasure in the doing of it. She woke early, earlier than the light, and breathed the mountain morning air and watched the sky change colors while Eli made the fire and heated water, and they ate and packed and moved, and the days were made of the trail and the horses and the mountains opening up and then closing in and then opening up again. And the evenings were made of fire and food and the kind of conversation that came when two people have eliminated social performance from the equation. She told him about her mother, who had been a small, fierce woman with red hair, and a garden she tended with the devotion other people reserved for religion. She told him about growing up in Gunnison, about the dress shop where she had worked before the Hargrove position, about the women in that shop who had been kind to her and the ones who had not been, about the way the town had opinions about a young woman without family connections who had a body that didn't conform to the particular ideal that 1882 demanded of women who wanted to be taken seriously. "They used to call me things," she said, on the third evening, looking into the fire. "The women in town sometimes, and some of the men." She said it without drama, as a plain fact. "I spent a long time trying to make myself smaller, trying to take up less space, to apologize for what I looked like by making my manner very small and quiet and convenient." Eli was mending a piece of harness, his large hands working methodically. He looked up at her. "And now?" "And now I ran 20 miles in the October mountains rather than let a man tell me what I owed him," she said. "So I suppose I have done with that." The corner of his mouth moved. "Good," he said, and went back to the harness, and Clara felt that single word warm her more thoroughly than the fire. It was on the 4th day of travel that things between them shifted in a way that was quiet and definite and required no ceremony to mark it. They had stopped to water the horse at a creek that ran fast and cold through a fold in the mountain, and Eli was letting the animal drink while Clara stood on a flat boulder and watched the water move, and she was doing that thing she sometimes did where she pulled at her coat to hold it across her front, unconsciously minimizing herself in the way she had been told for so many years was appropriate. "Stop doing that," Eli said. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same steady, direct attention he gave everything. Doing what? Trying to hide yourself. He said it the same way he said everything, without judgment, without drama, as a simple observation of fact that needed addressing. Pulling your coat around you like you were something that ought to be covered up. Clara felt the heat in her face and a flash of something defensive that she examined and then set aside. Old habit. I can see that. He left the horse and came to stand a few feet from her, and he was so large against the mountain afternoon that the light practically organized itself around him. You do not need to do that. She looked at him. You do not know what it is like, she said, not unkindly. Being the size I am, everywhere I've ever been, someone has had something to say about it. I know, he said. I have watched you walk the last 4 days carrying 40 pounds and keeping pace with a horse on mountain trails in late October. I know exactly what you look like, and I have not once thought anything was wrong with it. She looked at him for a long moment. The creek moved. A hawk circled high above. The afternoon light was going gold and long. Eli, she said. Do not hide your body, he said, quietly, but with the same absolute finality he brought to everything. Not from the cold, not from the mountain, not from me. You are not something that needs apologizing for. She stood on the boulder above the creek and looked at this enormous, quiet man who had found her lost in the dark and had brought her warmth and porridge and moccasins and the protection of his considerable presence and his careful watching. And she thought that she had never in her life been told anything as valuable as what he had just said, not in those exact words, not with that particular quality of absolute steadiness behind them. She did not cry, but it was a closer thing than it had been in a very long time. Thank you, she said. He held her gaze. It is just the truth, he said. She was aware, in that moment, of exactly how close they were standing on the boulder above the creek, and of the quality of the light, and of the fact that his eyes were the color of dark river water in the late afternoon sun. And she thought, with the clarity of something arriving rather than being arrived at, that she was in very significant trouble where Eli Cade was concerned. He seemed to think something similar, because he stepped back half a step and cleared his throat and said that they should push on another few miles before the light was entirely gone, and she agreed, and they went on. But something had been rearranged between them that could not be rearranged back, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it moved alongside them through the mountains like a fourth presence. That night they camped in a narrow valley where the wind could not reach them, and the fire was bright and close, and they talked for a very long time after supper, longer than any previous evening. He told her more about Missouri and about Anna, and she listened with the full attention she gave to things she believed mattered. He told her about his father, who had been a farmer and a hard man in the particular silent way of certain Midwestern farmers, and about his mother, who had read to him when he was small from whatever books she could beg or borrow, which was where the Keats had come from. She told him about her own reading, which had been sporadic and largely self-directed, and had included a Dickens she had found discarded behind the dress shop and had read 4 times. He laughed at that, a short, genuine sound, and she thought it was probably not something he did very often, and was all the more valuable for it. What do you want? He asked eventually, when the fire had burned low and the night was very quiet around them. Right now, she said. In general, in your life, she thought about it seriously. A kitchen of my own, she said. Work that I choose, rather than work I take because I have no options. A place where I am known for what I can do rather than what I look like. She paused. Someone who talks to me the way you do. He was very still for a moment. How do I talk to you? He asked quietly. Like what I say matters, she said. Like I am a person who has a right to her own life. She met his eyes in the firelight. Like I do not need to hide anything. The fire between them put warmth on both their faces, and the night was very large and very quiet, and Eli Cade looked at Clara Whitfield with an expression that was finally completely unguarded, and said nothing for a long time, and the nothing he said was louder than most things Clara had ever heard. Denver is 2 days away, he said finally. Yes, she said. I need to tell you something before we get there. Her pulse moved. All right. He took a breath and let it out slowly, and she had the sense of watching a man who had learned to contain himself doing the difficult work of releasing that containment. I had decided a long time ago that I was done with being connected to anyone, that I was better at being alone than at doing the other thing, that the mountains were easier than people. "And," she said, "and I have spent 6 days watching you climb mountains in borrowed moccasins with a pack on your back and your chin up. And I have listened to you talk about your life with more honesty than most people manage about the weather. And I have been corrected on several points by someone who quotes Dickens from memory and does not apologize for it." He paused. "And I am not sure I still believe what I decided." Clara felt her heart do something irreversible. She looked at his face in the firelight and thought about his books and his porridge and his moccasins and the flat way he had told Billy Crane that she was going where she chose and would answer to him. "Eli," she said. "You do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I know that," she said, "but I want to." She moved around the fire, just a little, closing the distance between them to something that was not a safe conversation distance, but was a different kind entirely. "I came running out of Gerald Hargrove's house with $4 and a bad map, because I was not willing to accept less than what I deserved. And I think what I deserve includes someone who sees me clearly and stays anyway." He looked at her. The firelight made his face very close to readable. "Clara, you see me clearly," she said. "You have from the moment you found me on that boulder." He reached out then, slowly, and his hand, large and warm and calloused from 8 years of mountain work, came up to the side of her face with a gentleness that was perfectly at odds with his size, and that was also, she thought, absolutely characteristic of him, because he was a man whose entire life was made of the careful application of great force to precise purposes. "I am not an easy man," he said. "I am not an easy woman," she said. "I am a red-headed runaway from Gunnison who argues with trappers about Dickens. We can be not easy together." He made that sound again, the short, genuine laugh, and then he leaned down and kissed her, careful and deliberate and entirely sure in the way he did everything, and the fire burned and the night held them, and the Colorado mountains did not care one bit, which was, Clara thought, entirely fine, because she had stopped needing the world to care and had started simply needing this. They arrived in Denver 4 days after leaving the mountain camp, where Eli had finally said what he meant, which was 3 days after Eli had pulled Clara up onto his horse so they could share the warmth of each other and the animal on the long, cold downslope into the eastern foothills. Denver in November of 1882 was a city of considerable energy and noise and ambition, and after 10 days in the mountains, it hit Clara like a wave, all the people and the horses and the smell of commerce and coal smoke and civilization. They found Edith on the 3rd attempt. Edith Whitmore, née Whitfield, was 31 years old and had grown from the kind girl Clara had met at 12 into a sturdy, practical, enormously warm woman with 4 children and a husband named Thomas, who drove freight and was usually not home, and a house on the eastern edge of Denver that was crowded and cheerful and smelled of baking. She took one look at Clara on her front step and burst into tears and pulled her inside. And then she looked at Eli Cade filling the doorway behind her and said with magnificent directness, "Are you the one who kept her alive in the mountains?" "We kept each other," Clara said. Edith looked between them at the way they stood slightly angled toward each other in the unconscious way of people who have spent 10 days in each other's constant presence and have reorganized themselves accordingly, and she smiled. "All right then," she said. "You had better both come in." The next several weeks were a rearrangement of everything. Eli did not go back to his mountain cabin immediately, though he had said he would. He found work in Denver loading freight for a week, and then another week helping a man who ran a livery stable, and he came to Edith's house every evening for supper, which Edith accepted with the equanimity of a woman who had seen more interesting things than a mountain man helplessly in love with her cousin. Clara found work quickly, because she was a magnificent cook, and Denver in 1882 needed cooks urgently, and within 2 weeks she was working at a large hotel on Larimer Street that served 3 meals a day and had opinions about the quality of its food that Clara was fully prepared to meet. She earned good money and paid Edith for her board, and felt for the first time in years that she was standing in her own life rather than in someone else's arrangement of it. Gerald Hargrove made one attempt to follow through. A letter arrived. She never knew how he'd gotten the address, addressed to Clara Whitfield and full of language about debts and obligations and what would happen if she did not return to Gunnison, and Clara read it once, gave it to Eli, and watched him read it with an expression that was very still and very cold. "He will not come here himself," Eli said. "Men like that do not come themselves, they send people." "I know," Clara said. "If anyone comes asking about you at the hotel, I will tell you immediately," she said. "I know." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket. "I'm going to send a letter of my own," he said. She looked at him. "To Hargrove?" "To the sheriff in Gunnison," he said. "There are laws about harassment, about the kind of behavior you described." He paused. "About men who grab women's wrists in their kitchens and come to their bedroom doors." Clara felt something complicated and warming move through her. "You want to protect me from 200 miles away." "I want to protect you from wherever I am," he said simply. He met her eyes. "Which is something I would like to discuss." They were in Edith's kitchen, which was where most of the meaningful conversations in that house happened, because Edith's kitchen was that kind of place, warm and cluttered and entirely hospitable to honesty. Eli was sitting at the table with his coffee cup and his folded letter, and his whole enormous presence filling the chair in a way that Clara had stopped noticing as remarkable, because it had simply become the way Eli-shaped space looked. "You said you wanted to discuss something," Clara said, sitting across from him. "I want to go back to the mountains," he said. "My lines need to be checked. My cabin needs winterizing. I have work up there that does not wait." He looked at his coffee cup and then at her. "But I do not want to go without knowing where things stand between us." "Things stand," Clara said carefully, "in a place that is fairly clear to me, but that I think you should say out loud." He looked at her with that familiar slight shift at the corner of his mouth. "You make nothing easy, Clara Whitfield." "No," she agreed pleasantly. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly in the way that was entirely characteristic of him, the way that stripped everything down to its necessary parts and presented them without decoration. "I want you to be my wife," he said, "when you are ready, whenever that is. I will come back from the mountain in spring, and if the answer is yes, I will not go back alone." Clara looked at Eli Cade, who had found her lost in the October dark, and had made her porridge and given her moccasins and told her not to hide herself, and had ridden between her and 3 men on a mountain trail, who read Keats with notes in the margins and laughed rarely and meant it always, who had kissed her beside a mountain fire with the careful, deliberate certainty of a man who did not do things unless he was sure of them. "I do not need until spring," she said. "The answer is yes." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood up and came around the table and put his hands on her face, both of them careful and certain, and she stood up to meet him, and they were there in Edith's kitchen in November in Denver, and the stove was warm, and the world outside was cold, and it was, Clara thought, exactly right. Edith, who came in from the pantry approximately 30 seconds later, said, "Finally," and went back to the pantry, and they both heard her laughing from behind the closed door. They were married in December of 1882, in a small church on the eastern edge of Denver, with Edith and Thomas and their 4 children and the hotel's head cook, a woman named Mrs. Paulson, who had taken a considerable shine to Clara, as witnesses. Clara wore a dark green dress she had made herself from fabric purchased with her first 3 weeks' wages, and Eli wore his best shirt and had visited a barber the day before, and he looked at her when she came into the church with an expression that had nothing contained about it at all, which was the most remarkable thing Clara had ever seen on his face. The Reverend was a small, nervous man who rushed through the ceremony at a pace that Clara suspected was partly about getting home to lunch. But the words were the words, and they meant what they meant. And when Eli said "I will" in his low, certain voice, the sound of it moved through the whole small church and settled into the walls, and Clara was fairly sure she would hear it for the rest of her life. They had a wedding supper at Edith's house, which Clara cooked herself, a roast chicken and a potato dish and a pie made from the last of the season's dried apples. And Thomas made a toast that was sincere if brief, and the children ran around and made a cheerful disaster of the kitchen, and Edith cried again, and it was warm and real and good. They spent their wedding night in the room Edith had prepared for them at the back of the house, with a good fire and a real bed rather than a mountain camp bedroll. And they were alone for the first time in a way that was different from the cabin and the trail, where circumstance had arranged them on opposite sides of fires. Here there was no fire between them and no circumstance keeping its distance, only the two of them and the winter dark outside the window and the warmth of the room. And Eli Cade was as careful and deliberate and thorough in this as in everything else he did. And Clara understood for the first time in her adult life what it felt like to be known completely and found entirely acceptable. In the morning, he made coffee and she made eggs, and they sat at the small table in the room, and she looked at him in the winter light, and he looked at her, and they drank their coffee and said very little. And it was the best morning Clara had ever had. He went back to the mountains in January, because the work was there and the season was good, and they had discussed it practically and decided together that a few months of separation was a reasonable trade for the trapline income that would help them plan their future. It was not an easy parting. Clara stood at the edge of Denver and watched him ride west and north into the pale winter morning, and then she turned around and went to work, because that was what she did, and because it was what he would have done, and because they had both agreed that being the kind of people they were was one of the reasons they had found each other. He wrote letters, which surprised her at first and then did not, because of course he did, because he had Keats with annotations in a careful hand. The letters were not flowery. They were written in the same way he spoke, direct and precise and occasionally wry, full of detail about the mountains in winter and the animals he tracked and the weather and the state of the cabin, and at the end of each one there was always a single sentence or two that was not practical in the least, and those sentences Clara kept in a small box by the bed. She wrote back at length, which was natural to her, and told him about the hotel and Mrs. Paulson and Edith's children and Denver and winter, and described the things she cooked with the kind of detailed pleasure that she had never before had an audience for. And he wrote back that her description of the potato gratin she had made for the hotel dining room had made him eat his dried elk with considerably less satisfaction than usual, and she laughed until Edith came to see what was happening. March came, and then April, and with it the first real warmth in the news that the mountain passes were open, and on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April, she came downstairs to find a horse tied at Edith's front gate, and Eli Cade sitting at Edith's kitchen table drinking coffee, as if he had never left. She stood in the doorway and looked at him, and he stood up, all of him, that enormous contained self of his, and looked at her with an expression that was as unguarded as she had ever seen it. "I said spring," he said. "You are a week early," she said. The pass was open. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and walked directly into him, and his arms came around her with the same careful, deliberate certainty as everything else he did. And she pressed her face against his chest and breathed, and he put his chin on top of her head, and they stood there in Edith's kitchen until Edith came in and said, "Oh, good, you are here," to Eli, and then moved around them to get to the stove, as if two people standing in the middle of her kitchen embracing were perfectly ordinary, which, in Edith's kitchen, they more or less were. They spent 2 weeks in Denver, talking about the future, with the same practical directness they brought to everything. He had spent the winter thinking, and had come back with a proposal that was straightforward and well considered, which Clara had expected, because he was who he was. He had identified a piece of land in the foothills south of Denver, still mountain country but lower than his trapline, at an altitude where winters were hard but manageable, with water and timber and enough flat ground to build something real. It was 20 acres, available for a price that was within reach of his winter earnings, combined with what Clara had saved from her hotel wages. There was nothing on it yet. It would need a cabin, then more. "It is not as wild as what I'm used to," he said, "but it is not the town either." "The middle distance," Clara said. "Yes." "Can we run cattle?" she asked. He looked at her. "You want cattle?" "I want something I can build," she said, "not just something I maintain. A trapline is maintaining. Cattle and a small herd and good land, that is building." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking it through with his characteristic thoroughness. "We could start small," he said. 10 head. See how the land handles it. I can still trap through the winter for income while the operation gets established." "Yes," she said. "That." He looked at her with that very particular expression that she had catalogued carefully and knew meant something like profound, quiet happiness, which in Eli Cade's case was exactly as significant as another man's complete exuberance. "You have thought about this before," he said. "I have thought about having a kitchen of my own and work I choose since I was 16 years old," she said. "I just needed land to put it on." They bought the land in May of 1883, and Eli spent the summer building the cabin with help he hired from 2 men who came recommended by Thomas, and Clara spent the summer working at the hotel and planning and making lists and refusing to minimize herself in any direction, which was becoming a habit she had no intention of breaking. She went out to the property on weekends and stood in the framed structure of what would be their home and looked at the mountains to the west and the foothills all around, and felt the particular quality of belonging that she had spent most of her life being told she was not entitled to. They moved in September, a year almost to the day after Clara had climbed out of Gerald Hargrove's window into the October night. The cabin was solid and well built, larger than Eli's mountain place, but with the same essential quality of a dwelling designed for function and permanence rather than impression. Clara put her kitchen together with the focused satisfaction of someone installing the most important room in the world, and Eli built her a work table that was the right height for her specifically, because he had measured and thought and done it right, and she ran her hand along its surface on the first morning in their home and felt something so complete it had no adequate word. They had 6 cattle by the end of that first fall, Eli's trapline running in the high country from November through February, and the operation was small but sound and getting sounder. Their nearest neighbors were a family called the Brennans, 5 miles south, Irish immigrants who had been in Colorado for 4 years and knew the country well, and their nearest town was a small place called Cedar Ridge, 8 miles east, which had a dry goods store and a post office and a doctor and not much else, which was exactly the right amount. The first winter in the cabin was hard and wonderful. The snow came heavy that year and the wind found the gaps in things, and Eli worked constantly to keep the place tight and warm, and Clara cooked and preserved and managed their supplies with a competence that Mrs. Paulson at the hotel had been right to respect, and in the long evenings when the storm was loud against the windows, they read. She had acquired 2 more Dickens, and he had his Keats, and they had discovered a shared admiration for Mark Twain, which had produced a conversation lasting the better part of 3 evenings, and talked, and were quiet, and were together. And Clara understood that she had found the thing she had aimed at when she stepped out of that window into the dark. A life that was actually hers. In February, she told him she was expecting a child. He was at the workbench cleaning a rifle when she said it, and he went entirely still in the way he had when he was processing something significant. Then he set the rifle down very carefully and turned around and looked at her. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, a dish towel over her shoulder, watching him with the particular mix of certainty and vulnerability that important news carried. He crossed the room in 2 steps and took her face in both his hands and kissed her forehead, then her mouth, and then he said, "Clara," in the voice he kept for the things that genuinely moved him, which was quiet and deep and absolutely sincere. "A baby," she confirmed, as if he might need clarification. "I heard you," he said. "I'm just—" He stopped. He seemed to be having some difficulty with his composure, which was remarkable and lovely. "I thought, after Anna, I was not sure I would—" "You are going to be a father," she said. He held her gaze for a moment that was very long and very quiet, and then he pulled her into his arms with the same careful, deliberate force he always used, and she felt his heart beating against her cheek, fast and strong, and she closed her eyes and thought that a woman who had run away in the October dark with $4 and a bad map had arrived at something very much better than Denver. Their son was born in September of 1883, which was a year and 11 months after Clara had climbed out of that window, and he came into the world with a quantity of dark hair that was clearly from his father, and a set of lungs that suggested he had extensive opinions and planned to share them, and they named him James Thomas Cade, the Thomas for Edith's husband, who had been quietly kind to both of them from the beginning. Eli held his son for the first time, sitting on the edge of the bed in the early morning light, the doctor having done his work and departed, Edith having come from Denver for the birth, and now sleeping on the sitting room floor because she was Edith and had insisted, and Clara watching from the bed with the profound exhaustion of new mothers and the equally profound clarity that came with it. Eli looked at James Thomas Cade as if he was doing an inventory of something irreplaceable. His enormous hands were around the baby with a precision and gentleness that made Clara's throat tighten. The baby made a small squirming sound, and Eli adjusted without a second's hesitation, the same instinct he had for all living things that were under his protection. "He is very small," Eli said. "He's a perfectly normal size," Clara said. "He has your nose. He has your hair. That's not going to be easy for him." "It will be fine," Clara said, and felt the warmth of it move through her entirely. "We will manage it." He looked up at her over the baby, and his face was completely open in a way she had learned to read over 2 years of knowing him, and what it said was happiness of the kind that comes from things working out better than you ever had the nerve to plan for. "You're good at that," he said. "At what?" "At knowing what we will manage." She held his gaze. "So are you," she said. "You just say it differently." He looked back at the baby. "What do you say, James Thomas?" he asked quietly, in the same voice he used for the horse and the cattle, low and steady and full of attention. "What do you think of all this?" James Thomas Cade appeared at the moment to have no firm opinions, being approximately 2 hours old, but his father held him as if the question were entirely worth asking. The years that followed were built the way good things are built, steadily, with attention, with the occasional setback and the ongoing work of maintenance. Their cattle operation grew from 6 to 20 to 30 head by 1886, and Eli had largely retired the trapline by then, because the land had begun to provide what they needed, and he was building the kind of operation that required his full attention, which he gave it in exactly the way he gave everything his attention, fully and without reservation. Clara ran the household with the same efficiency she had always had, and her kitchen was exactly what she had dreamed of at 16, generous and well-equipped by the standards of the time, and she cooked for her family and occasionally for the Brennans when times were hard for them, and occasionally for the small community around Cedar Ridge when it needed feeding. She had a reputation in the area for her cooking that pleased her in a way that had nothing to do with praise and everything to do with the knowledge that she was doing what she was good at on her own terms. James grew into a serious dark-haired boy who had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and who by the age of 4 had appointed himself the primary assistant to all operations on the property, which his father treated with complete gravity. Eli could be found, on any given afternoon, explaining to his son with full seriousness the relevant principles of fence maintenance or cattle behavior, and James absorbed it all with the concentrated attention of a small person who takes his responsibilities seriously. In 1885, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Anna, for the woman Eli had loved and lost and honored by becoming someone who knew how to love again. She was a round, cheerful baby who was the absolute opposite of her serious brother in disposition, if not in the dark hair they both shared. And she made the cabin loud in an entirely different way than James did. And Eli sat with her in the evenings, and she grabbed his fingers and laughed at him, and he let himself be laughed at entirely willingly, which Clara thought was one of the finest things she had ever seen. The matter of Gerald Hargrove resolved itself quietly, and without requiring Clara to do anything at all. The letter Eli had sent to the Gunnison sheriff in the winter of 1882 had apparently had some effect. Gunnison in 1882 had a sheriff who took his responsibilities reasonably seriously, and Hargrove had been persuaded by whatever the sheriff said to abandon his pursuit. The town, Clara heard from occasional letters from Tom Briggs at the dry goods store, who had taken it upon himself to serve as informal correspondent, had developed opinions about Hargrove that were unflattering and getting more so, and by 1884 he had sold his property and moved somewhere in Utah, and the name gradually ceased to occupy any space in Clara's daily thoughts at all, which was the best possible outcome. Edith and Thomas came to visit in the summer of 1885, all 4 children packed into their wagon with the optimism of parents who have dealt with difficult travel before, and the visit lasted 2 weeks and was loudly chaotic and entirely wonderful. Edith walked the property with Clara on the second morning of the visit and looked at the cabin and the cattle and the well-kept garden and Eli at the fence line with James perched on his shoulder, and she said, "You built something real here, Clara Mae." "We did," Clara said. "He is a good man." "Yes," Clara said. "He is an exceptionally good man." Edith looked at her with the expression of a woman who knows everything she needs to know about a subject. "You look the way you ought to look," she said. "That is all I wanted to say." Clara thought about that for a moment. "Thank you for being there when I showed up on your step," she said. "Cousins," Edith said, as if this were a complete sentence and a sufficient explanation of all related obligations, which Clara thought was exactly right. By 1887, the Cade operation had expanded enough to require a hand, and they hired a young man named Will Shafter from Cedar Ridge, 17 and eager, and not too proud to be corrected, which Eli appreciated. He taught Will in the same quiet, thorough way he did everything, and Will turned out to be good with cattle and careful with the horses and entirely trustworthy, which were the three things that mattered most on a working property in the Colorado foothills in 1887. Their third child arrived in the spring of 1888, another son whom they named Robert, and who was a solid red-haired baby who looked so entirely like Clara that Eli held him the first time and looked from the baby to Clara and back and said with the quality of genuine awe, "There are now two of you." And Clara said, "God help you both." And they were both laughing when Robert opened his eyes for the first time and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone who has not yet formed an opinion but is gathering data. Robert was a joyful child. He was also, by the age of 2, a considerable physical challenge, being possessed of both his father's energy and his mother's stubbornness, but directed primarily toward climbing things that were not meant to be climbed. Eli handled this with the same calm certainty he brought to managing livestock, which Clara found genuinely impressive. James, by 8, was helping with the cattle in a way that was no longer merely symbolic. He had his father's gift for quiet observation and his mother's decisiveness, and he was going to be something, though Clara was not yet sure what. Anna, at 6, was reading everything she could get her hands on, having inherited the family book habit, and had strong opinions about Mark Twain that were not dissimilar to her father's. Robert, at 2, was simply an ongoing adventure. On a Sunday evening in October of 1888, 6 years to the month after Clara had walked out of Gunnison in the dark, she sat on the porch of their cabin in the October dusk and looked at the mountains to the west, which were the same mountains they had always been, enormous and indifferent and extraordinary, and listened to the sounds of the house behind her, Eli's voice and James's, discussing something about a fence section that needed work. Anna reciting something to Robert, who was making enthusiastic sounds that suggested he found it entertaining. The fire in the kitchen stove, which she had laid before coming outside, ticking and settling into its evening rhythm. The air was cold with the particular clarity of October at altitude, and the light on the mountains was going gold and long, and 6 years ago she had been cold and lost and alone on a boulder in the dark. And now she was here. Eli came out behind her and sat in the other chair and put his coffee on the railing and looked at the mountains with her in the easy silence that had been their shared language for 6 years. "October," she said. "Yes," he said. 6 years. He turned and looked at her. She turned and looked at him. He was still enormous and still made of the same mountain material he always had been, with gray at his temples now and a few more lines around his eyes from years of squinting into high-altitude light, and he was still the most present person she had ever been in a room with. "Best decision I ever made," he said, "was going to check that trap line at 3 in the morning." "You found a lost woman on a boulder," she said. "I found a woman who knew where she was going," he said, and his voice was entirely serious and entirely warm. "I was the one who was lost." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The mountains held their light a little longer. Behind them, the house was warm and full of living. "We found each other," she said. He reached across and took her hand, his large, scarred, capable fingers wrapped around hers, the way they had been on 100 evenings on this porch and would be on 100 more, and they sat in the Colorado October dusk, and the mountains were exactly themselves, and the years ahead were unwritten, and the years behind were built well and solid, And it was, Clara Mae Cade thought, with the full, deliberate gratitude of a woman who had chosen her life and made it real, everything she had ever been brave enough to want. James would later say, when he was grown and had a family of his own in the Gunnison Valley, full circle as things tend to go, that the first thing he learned from his parents was that you could build anything if you were willing to work in the honest direction. Anna would say that what she learned was that love looked like moccasins and porridge, and a man who told you not to hide yourself, and she would look for exactly that when her time came. Robert, who grew up red-haired and joyful and built for both adventure and stubbornness, would say that what he learned was that being lost was sometimes just how you found the right trail. Eli and Clara were married for 31 years before time did what time always does, and in all those years he never once let her diminish herself, and she never once let him hide behind the mountain and call it peace. And between them, they built a life in the Colorado foothills that was real and warm and fully their own, and the mountains to the west watched over it with the ancient indifference of things that outlast everything and miss nothing. On the last evening of October in 1882, a woman with red hair and $4.17 had stood on a mountain boulder in the dark and refused to cry and looked at the stars, and the world had answered her, not with comfort, but with something better, with a man on horseback coming out of the tree line, and a voice as level and clear as mountain water saying, "I can see you." She had let herself be seen. Everything else, as Clara Mae Cade would tell her grandchildren years later when they were old enough to sit still for a story, was just the rest of a very good life.